Here we're going to be talking about the future of waste collection, which I think is a really important topic, particularly I think in the UK and across Europe, and also for developing countries. One of the things I find odd is that we talk about waste collection now, and we're trying to collect resources, particularly when we're talking about things like end-of-life electricals and electronics, and then wondering why the systems we use treat them like waste, even though we're only talking about waste systems. I mean, apart from the size, colour or shape of your bin, really very little's changed. And I think it's very important that we look at this because developing countries are looking to try and mimic what we do already. So if you had to predict the future of waste collection in developed countries, Pete, where would be your option? Where would you be looking at?
Well, I think you've highlighted one of the issues here, that if you're starting from a relatively young position in terms of waste management, then what do you look to as a template for developing systems? And in some ways we've learned a lot, and in others we've still got a long way to go. So as you've highlighted, the basic mode of collection hasn't really shifted in a very, very long time, apart from what we put in the bins and the bins that we've got. Whether there is something that we can predict accurately is a moot point, but I think what we need to do is kind of start off with a perhaps more radical system and take into account things that we've not looked at before. So if you look at example for countries in equatorial regions, then you've got a situation where just things like heat and humidity make a massive amount of difference to the problem. So if you've got food waste, for example, if you've got organics, you don't want them kicking around in a bin for 2 months. So the systems that we've got have kind of adjusted towards that. So weekly collection of food waste has made a big difference in the UK because the residuals carry less organics. But there's still the problem that you've got high quantities of material that you can't afford to leave around in a bin for a long time in some circumstances.
I totally agree, and one of the problems I've seen in developing countries is added to that heat and humidity, the concept of the rainy season. Yes. Now, of course, being British, we're obsessed with the fact it rains, but we haven't seen anything compared to the rainy season in some other countries, and so in often cases, people are encouraged to burn out collection points because it's not sensible to try and collect the waste. And we've been to countries where they've actually seen increases in cancer incidences of people who live near collection points. Now, we can't say empirically that that's linked to the burning of mixed plastics and organic wastes, but your heart, rather than your scientific principles, say that there is a strong correlation.
Yeah, and do you think there's a lack of awareness of what needs to be brought into the plans? So it's easy to say that there's a lack of planning, but then you have to know exactly what has to be planned into the system so that you plan it appropriately to avoid those sort of things happening.
I think that's absolutely spot on, and I think one of the things that if you look at waste collection systems throughout, and I say waste, but I really mean waste and resource collection systems throughout the world, one thing we're not doing is we're trying to collect it so it's convenient for the person who's putting it in the box. We don't seem to have really caught on to the fact that if we're talking about a resource or a material someone else might want, that we should be collecting it in a way that they would like it received. If you were, I don't know, Coca-Cola, and someone says, oh, well, we'll give you all the metal that you need to make your aluminium cans, but it'll be dirty and covered in mud, and you have to do all this to it. Well, Coca-Cola will go, but that's not what we want. And I think we need to review the way we're delivering it, but also I think we need to look fundamentally at the responsibilities. We have an issue with a plant locally, and someone was saying to me, well, they shouldn't be building a new waste treatment plant. What they should be doing is providing, increasing our recycling rates. Well, ignoring the fact that recycling isn't top of the waste hierarchy and we should have other issues first, there's other issues with that, in that actually it's not the local authority. The local authority provide let's be honest, a pretty good service. And even the services we think are quite poor, it's because we have very high expectations. And if you go to other countries, you'd see quite how bad they are in some cases. But people don't feel they have any responsibility for those collections. I said to a guy, I was in a public meeting with a guy, and he said, I recycle all my waste. I said, really? So you have no black bag collection, no black bin collection? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, if you recycle all of it, you don't have this coming through. And he said, don't be ridiculous, that's the council who collect that. So clearly doesn't recycle anything, but has no understanding of his role.
Yes. And I think, could I just have a look at it in more detail? You were talking about the collection systems being designed for the user, but not for the receiver. I think that's a really, really critical point. So if we're going to make the system streamlined, so we've got optimal use of the materials that have recovered, then you need the right level of segregation, and in a way that aligns with the needs of the user as well. And I think that's one thing that we kind of looked into in highly developed systems, and it's an opportunity for developing countries so they can avoid making the mistakes that we've made, in which we don't really regard householders as people who are preparing materials for recycling. They're getting the materials out of their house in a way that kind of makes sense to them. But we don't flip that around, do we? We don't look at what people actually want at the end of this.
No, and I'm a big advocate of pay as you throw, mainly because I believe it gives householders some responsibility and some reward for good environmental behaviour that they get if they use less water or electricity. And interesting to see how actually willingness to pay and paying for services is really taking off in parts of the developed world. We visited a town in Uganda near Makere, where they're very keen on cleaning up the environment, and you know their waste management is many stages behind ours. But in one town that's used an exemplar, they have two collections. So they have organic and everything else, which is pretty much plastics, let's be honest. And people pay for it. And there is a man whose job it is to go and collect the money, and he keeps a percentage of the money. And this had been going on for a few months. And I said to him, so are you having problems collecting money? Thinking, you know, we've been told if you brought this in the UK, it would be highly unpopular. And he said, no, I'm not, because people see the impact it has. The price is pitched, so it's compared to how much a beer might cost you in the shop. So and you pay more if you're a business. But he said, no, people are willing to pay because they see the impact it's having. Mm. And I think it gives people some responsibility. So they were being used as an example throughout the area.
But I think you've hit on a problem more broadly here, that it's the visibility of what happens after you act in a certain way. So, you know, if I do something as an individual, then the impact of that happens somewhere else. And as an individual, you have such a minute impact that there's an easy way out of this, that you can say, well, what difference does it make what I do? I think if you've got a situation like that where there's an obvious linkage between waste practices and the local environment, there's a much better opportunity to invoke something like that and to engage people in that, because they get a benefit from doing that in terms of the environmental improvements.
Yeah, I mean, I tweeted some pictures yesterday, having gone for a walk with my friend, and I was less than half a mile, so maybe 5-10 minutes walk from the local waste collection point where you can take stuff for free. And there were large amounts of fly tipping. And that's just people who can't be bothered, because there is actually no reason why they can't take it there. And one of the other reasons I think pay as you throw would be advantageous is because then we get the money to be able to chase those people. But if we then look at the responsibility throughout the value chain and the supply chain, then we move on to the idea of producer responsibility and maybe value chain responsibility. We regularly hear that it's the manufacturers or the supermarkets in the UK that are responsible for it. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how producer responsibility might be used to get more effective collection or maintain materials in a cycle more effectively.
Well, I think that there's a kind of radical version of this, which is starting to emerge in, I believe, Japan, where for high value materials, things like electric vehicles is one example, then there's a shift towards a lease basis, which means that the responsibility of the producers becomes a kind of an ownership model. So rather than actually having responsibility for looking forward and trying to make things happen in the best way possible and building a cost in, then by owning the resources in the vehicle, then they can maintain capture of that at a very high level. So I think that there's a lot of criticisms of EPR, and I don't know if it really works. I mean, there's problems here with reuse in particular. So, what do you do with compartments? If we with components, what do we do with devices or products that can't be reused, that become redundant either because of the owner or the technology? If we can't get bits back out of that that can be reused, then there's a limit. And particularly with small items, I mean, if you look at the amount of recoverable metals in a single mobile electronic device, the very, very, very small quantities of recoverable metal. So you have to have the bulk before it becomes worthwhile actually doing this. So that's where the producers can score. But equally, there's a problem with the intermittency of supply, the numbers, how many arise, how often, and where they are. So it's the bulking that I think is a real challenge.
I think also that it would depend on the materials, and I wonder if sometimes even within something like electronics, there are so many complexities that actually you can't have a one-size-fits-all system. For example, small electronics are very easy to put in your bin.
Yes.
So and actually probably unviable to take to a centralised collection point, unless that centralised collection point is where you might purchase the replacement, which is what I think the WE Directive tried to achieve. But I think developing countries have some great opportunities for this. And I saw some really good examples in India where the supermarket, the local supermarket, and I cannot remember the name of it, in Delhi, had take back. So basically they would pay you a set rate per kilo for taking back metals or other commodities. So therefore there isn't really an issue with the waste collection, because there's a clearly and obviously stated value to them. Please continue.
Oh, and I think there's a good opportunity there to create a habit as well. So people then routinely return waste items to the place that they're buying new products from. So there's no additional journeys need to be made. There's an incentive there in the financial reward. And again, this works in places like the Netherlands, where the kind of hole in the wall thing has an automatic detector of the type of material, credits you with the amount of the deposits, and then you get the reduction at the till. So things like that are very, very easy to use and can be kind of habituated very, very quickly, are really worthwhile. But you do need the infrastructure, and you need people to use it as well.
Yeah, I think the need for the infrastructure is one of the problems, particularly in developing countries, because of the cost of them. And I was quite surprised to see how much a collection pit costs, or collection shape space costs in Africa compared to here. And the answers are very similar, despite the fact that labour is much cheaper. But also there are other issues that related to health and safety that we would never tolerate. I talked to some guys who collect, and they all have needle stick injuries, and they expect it on a daily basis. Now, that would be local paper at least newsworthy.
Yes.
And the roads often aren't good enough, so we need to have different systems. And maybe these countries, these developing countries, have the opportunity to make that circle that we use going you know, across where we're talking about stuff that may be exported to China or somewhere else, have the opportunity to use things much more locally. But I think sometimes we overcomplicate them, and sometimes we don't make them, unfortunately, complicated enough. So one of the aspects, I think, is just, I think absolutely separate collection and segregated collection is key. And it's great to see some charities out there like Waste Aid who are actually doing things to set up local industry. And if there's a demand from local people, then that's where you get the separate collection, because you can see the impact straight away. Then we just got a question through, but I've lost it.
It's disappeared.
Yes. Yes. So hold on. What methods can help achieve 100% collection in developing countries at low cost? Unfortunately, the answer to that is none, or a bit of everything, in my opinion. What's your opinion on that, Pete? Wait until you take your glass of water.
I think 100% is worthwhile as a very loose target, as an ambition, but whether it's achievable or not anywhere, I don't know. I doubt very much, because there'll always be something that's lost. But I think that the system that you've described could come close to that, because if you have people who are willing to separate things out into a quite refined set of different materials or products, and you've got very high compliance with the system, then you've got the best chance possible of doing that. But that also can align with the users. So if you have a series of separate collections that have, for example, batteries that are separated from other electrical items, then you've got a win-win situation, because for recovery of materials, reprocessing, etc., you've got a much better differentiated stream of materials, and also you assist things in terms of health and safety.
Yeah.
So just by removing lithium cells, for example, then you've moved one of the big hazards for waste electrical and electronic equipment immediately. So that there's a prospect of doing that, but you still need everyone to engage with the system, understand how it works, and use it. And even with batteries, then the marking of batteries, the identification of different types of cells doesn't have any international standards. So you have to unpick those at almost battery by battery level to achieve what you need.
I mean, I think actually, as a question on what would achieve it, it's a really interesting, because without that separate collection, none of the other stuff along that chain will work. I mean, we have issues with contamination, but if you when we were in Uganda, and I've seen it in other countries as well, you look in the collection point and you've got your domestic waste, so which is maybe 50-60% organic, the rest mainly plastics, but then you've got business waste and medical waste. Now, do you want to buy something made of recycled plastic that's been sitting in a bin next to abortion waste?
No.
No, exactly. So this separate collection, and maybe different standards for householders and different standards for businesses and what they're expected to do. I think it should be reflected in the whole thing. But the other aspect is that in developing countries, what goes in the bin is nearly always waste. Whereas in developed countries, what goes in the bin is often still perfectly functional. I tell people regularly of a time where I saw a return of a top-of-the-range fridge freezer, which retails new in excess of £1,000, to be sent for recycling, because the people who owned it decided they would rather have a red kitchen than a cream kitchen. Now, that level of affluence and ignorance is amazing and doesn't happen in a lot of less affluent countries, and frankly shouldn't happen here. I don't understand how it happens here. But when we go further on and those countries, the development gap starts to change, those collection schemes are going to be more and more important. And I think I've discussed this with governments abroad, as I'm sure you have, and many other people, that actually that separate collection is key, because that brings your waste stream and brings your material that you can then do the technologies on. I think worrying about one of the differences between collection in developing and developed countries is we worry about how we move, as you mentioned earlier, the stuff that's suitable for reuse out of the waste stream. Whereas I think in developing countries, it pretty much doesn't hit the waste stream. So that's one complexity we have to deal with, whereas other countries don't. But the fundamental of how do you get people to put things in that right bin, none of us appear to have cracked, which is amazing, really.
And there's been a lot of research effort in this, and I think one of the problems with this is that we're constrained to one-size-fits-all approaches. So there's no way that you can customize a collection scheme to the needs of an individual. So we have, by its very nature, a need to compromise. So we need to try and generate a system that meets most people's needs most of the time, which I think is possibly why we've ended up with the sort of systems that we've ended up with. Because if we put in too high demands on everyone, then the capability of recognizing and segregating every different type of materials might not be always at an optimum level. And more to the point, we kind of need to promote things in a general way as well. So, you know, trying to get everyone to do everything that they can, we need to understand the deficits, and we need to adjust individual people's behaviour so that they'll do the same thing. And that's a hard call. Even with a sort of best case scenario with a high recycling rates in the UK or a European country, getting total capture of all the material is still a long, long way off.
And then there's other more modern systems. I mean, we've been talking really about your traditional bin, but there's intelligent bins. There's pneumatic collection systems that seem to be particularly effective in multiple occupancy properties. But I've yet to see if there's any big issues or research done on the impacts on contamination of different kinds of collection schemes. Are you aware of anything? Not specifically on those sort of systems, other than that contamination is a word that's used very, very frequently by local authorities. So it's always an ongoing problem, and there may be technological fixes. You know, if there's a separator, for example, that dealt with waste as it arose in a large occupancy building, then you might get somewhere, but it's the expense of installing something like that. I don't know of any system where it's been shown to work better than anything else, because ultimately people put things into a container or a chute, wherever they put it, you still need them to make that right decision at the householder's end. I think the one thing we can probably all agree on, us and anybody else watching this, is that convenience is key. There's been a large amount of research, but I think there's still room for more research on the impact of convenience on people's uptake. But I find it interesting that we seem to focus very much in the UK particularly on convenience at the doorstep, whereas for more centralised collection, they seem to be moving more and more to relying on people having cars or transport. So whereas in other European countries you will see iceberg collection systems where you have a very small collection point above ground and a large one underground, so you can fit bottles, plastics, cans, paper, whatever, in a relatively small area and in an urban area, so many people use it. I've not seen any really good examples of that in the UK, and we tend to have, I know from my point of view, if I was to go take anything other than my doorstep collection stuff for recycling, I would have to drive. And I would even have to drive outside my normal route to work, which takes me through town.
Yes.
And I think so we need to make sure that we're balancing all the different options. We've got a question about food waste grinders to separate organic and inorganic waste. I'm not familiar with them separating, but I know we've got, in the UK, there've been big issues in London about waste disposal units, in particular from restaurant premises, and how they're overwhelming our sewage works because too much stuff is going down them. And I think we're, in the UK, probably because we're reliant on such a large amount of Victorian infrastructure, it's problematic. I don't know if it's planned for more sensibly in other countries.
I think you've hit the nail on the head with the existing infrastructure. I think in some respects then waste disposal units, kind of kitchen grinders, the idea of using them then basically gives added value to the sewage system in that you have your kind of collection systems in the kitchen, and the transport system for the waste adds nothing onto the existing demand. So I think that is quite useful, but as you highlight, then it's the sewage capacity and the sewage treatment capacity. And I think one of the problems that we've got, certainly on a UK, if not European level, is that we're not really fully geared up to utilise sewage in a sensible way. So we tend to regard it as a problem that needs to be treated, rather than, again, like waste in general, a resource that we can tap into and that we can use. And again, we've got problems with the antiquated sewage system in that we've got road runoff and industrial waste mixed in with food waste. So as a substrate for composting, it has certain deficiencies.
So do you think, if you were to sort of summarise those discussions we've had, that what you're saying is that really for collection, we need to have a radical think rather than a tweak about how we do collection, and then see if, because we're more advanced in this respect than a lot of developing countries, that we can then show them examples of how to do it better, rather than to perpetuate the errors that we've already been through and would argue are still going through.
Yeah. I think we need to start off with a paradigm shift. When we started off on this conversation, you mentioned thinking of waste as a resource and not waste. And I think that's absolutely critical, because once you start to do that, then you realise that collection systems are actually part of a broader means by which we can get value from what we no longer need. And I think if you begin from that point, then you look at collection systems as a means of getting maybe products and materials back into the system in a way that we can use. And then we need to work backwards from that and design the collection systems to do that. So I think we're still, the bigger problem is that we're still stuck in the mentality of regarding things as waste rather than resources. And while we view that in that way, then we're not going to have the right momentum to do things differently and better.
I couldn't agree more with that. One of the things I found interesting, where some recent research that was being done, and they said it was about different waste collection. It wasn't. It was research about trying to get more people to participate in existing collection schemes. Yes. And I think it's interesting when we talk about collection and participation, and I think it's a very different message, whether you're trying to get people who currently participate to a greater extent, or people who don't participate to start participating. And there's been some interesting research I briefly looked at today about how there's a disconnect between what people think they're doing and what they're actually doing. And I think this is one of the big problems we have with waste, that we have all these people who think they're recycling everything, and then they're not. Anyway.
I think there's a third category of person as well, and that's people who are actually doing a lot already. So we tend to focus on the people who still have kind of deficits in what they're doing, so they're not doing everything that we want them to do in exactly the right way. But what about the people who are active recyclers, good recyclers? Then what do we do for them? Because they are people who could be exemplars, they could be block leaders, champions, but also, why are they producing waste that needs to be recycled? So it highlights the need to look at other areas. So if I'm recycling everything that's produced in my house, then it doesn't make me brilliant or perfect. it means that I'm doing a good job in one respect. So why aren't I buying things, or why am I not able to buy things that are packaged more efficiently in better packaging that's more appropriate?
See, one of the things I was surprised by, not really surprised, but I hoped for with the circular economy package coming out of Europe, were that they would say you cannot put anything on the market in Europe unless there is a viable end-of-life solution for it.
Yes.
And that, I think, in many cases, that would have had very little impact. But I think in big companies where you have an imbalance or different priorities between the people who are dealing with sustainability and the people who are dealing with design, I think it would have given a real impetus to do what we all want to do, which is to take that aspect of design, and what does it, they say 80% of material of waste is caused at the design stage, but we still haven't cracked how to push people to do that. Then if we do that, then we could be in a position where we actually need a lot less collection because we have a lot less waste coming through. I would hesitate to suggest we start designing our waste collection systems on a significant reduction in waste volumes, but we're still doing these messages to people. So reducing bin size, reducing bin collection frequency, and every time we get that, we get some debate. I'm sure you have this as well. I know some of your colleagues do, that someone says, oh, we're going to go to 3 weekly collections. And the media all go, oh, 3 weekly collections? What will happen with that? What do you think about this? And we all, get on, the journalists get off the phone, on the phone to us, and we all go, it's actually not a bad idea at all. There's a strong correlation between waste arisings and frequency of collection. And then they say, well, what if they're smaller bins? And you go, still, there's a correlation with that. And I seem to have spent a disproportionate amount of time showing people microchip housings in wheelie bins. And people go, oh, but it's very unusual to put a microchip housing in a wheelie bin. And I would point out to them, if it was very unusual, it wouldn't be industry standard for the last 20 years. Though, unfortunately, I have to confess, the last journalist I tried to demonstrate that to, I then realised my wheelie bin was manufactured in 1987 and couldn't show him at all because it doesn't have one. But again, I think this is a message where we're trying to tweak what we do to change the behaviours rather than fundamentally rethink it. And so, for example, I don't know if overseas people watching this are aware of the complexities of collection in the UK, and that you can go from one authority to another and see that different materials are collected, or that you can see that they're collected in a different colour box or a different container, and all the politics and behaviour change that needs to go around them. So if you can think of a colour, there will be an authority in the UK that probably collects something in a box that colour. And government is putting time and effort into reviewing how to standardise those, whereas maybe they should have first thought whether is that the correct way to be collecting.
Yeah, it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yes, exactly.
But I was just thinking about this, and one of the things here is about how people see the value of what they do. So if you have a microchip bin and you have pay as you throw, then people usually focus on the financial aspect of that, but also you see the reward in terms of reduced waste. So we've had this with installation of water meters, and my personal individual view is that I'm much more pleased by the reduction in the volume of water that we're using since we've been metered than the financial cost. I've got a much better idea of the environmental benefit than the financial benefit to me. And that's a way of connecting people with their behaviour. So there's a possible advantage there in pay as you throw, or giving people weight data on the things that they dispose of, and that there's a feedback mechanism. You can tell people how they're doing. You can do that at individual level, you can do that at community level if you have adequate data capture. Do you think that would be a step in a good direction in the UK or elsewhere?
I think it would be very interesting to see. I find it intriguing to think that when we've talked about pay as you throw, people always talk about how it's unfair on large families, how it's a hidden tax, etc., with very little consideration of the aspect of rewarding good behaviour. So when they brought in water meters, they didn't say, so if you use more water, you'll pay more. They said, so if you're sensible with your water use, you'll pay less. Mm. Yes. But that message hasn't come across. And there's been quite a lot of research in developing countries about this whole aspect of willingness to pay. And I think if nothing else, the aspect of paying directly for the volume of so I've just had a note that says New York calls it save as you throw, which is exactly what we should be doing in this country. So I will try and change my terminology for that. But I think part of it is really this idea of raising awareness. So your comment about I'm then aware of how much water I'm using, so I'm pleased that I'm doing better, I think is interesting, because that would also be true of waste generation for a lot of people, and most people like a challenge, and it gives opportunities for different challenges. One of the reasons that people are so supportive of food waste separate collections, and it has been argued you shouldn't have separate food waste collections because there shouldn't be a need for separate food waste collections, though I'm rubbish at home composting, mainly because it's practical, and I'm rubbish at anything that's remotely practical. And so I'm realistically not going to do that. However, I'm more than happy to participate in a separate food waste collection. I could do more stuff to minimise my food waste generation, but it's unlikely I'm going to find something that I can do with my banana peel or my onion skin. However, one of the things I am aware of is when I generate food waste, is because I collect it separately, how much of it I actually have. So a lot of this stuff about charging, like your point about water, is really about raising awareness. And I think when we're looking at how much we generate, we should also look at the capacity associated with that. So I think we've made a mistake historically by giving people big bins and unlimited, because it's like your salary, isn't it? The more you earn, the more you spend. So without being too personal, I noticed that your office is maybe not as streamlined as others might be. My office used to be like that, and then they moved us into a different office with a lot less cupboards. So therefore, because I had less space, I needed less space. And I think this is an issue that we all have. You know, I think it's human nature.
Yes. But I think, just coming back to the issue of food waste, I think there's an important point here, that if your bins are too large, then you actually allow people to do things. So obviously there's a negative there in that if you've got a very large bin for non-recyclable materials, it makes it easier to throw them away. I think there's a risk that we put fuel on the fire by allowing people to do too much as well. So if you have too much facility for recycling, if you're buying lots and lots of stuff that you don't need, and you feel good about it, or you feel okay because you're recycling the packaging, it doesn't actually mean that much. It doesn't mean that you've done something that's really useful or good. Equally, I think a better example is food waste, because if I'm composting lettuces that I bought and I didn't eat, then having the food waste collection bin in my kitchen means that I can do that, and I can feel good about making compost from lettuces. So I think that there's a kind of an offset here as well, that people invariably believe that they're doing the right thing by recycling, but in some ways the need for recycling systems or collection systems is an artifact of overconsumption.
That's a very good point, yes.
All right, so it almost kind of legitimizes buying more than you need if you can do something useful with it when you've decided you're going to throw it away.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because when we're talking about collection schemes, you're right. We're always assuming that it's a positive to have the material there to recycle and then collect, whereas it's not always. I had a discussion with an agent for a large manufacturer where I bought something from them, and I said it comes in a ridiculous amount of packaging. It didn't need all of that, and they said, "Ah, yes, but it's all recyclable." I said, "Yes, but unnecessary." So recyclable and unnecessary is wrong. And I think this is really where we talk all the time about how we learn, how the developing world can learn from us. And I think sometimes it's quite patronising. I've been involved in an e-waste project where some of the people in some of the African partners have said, "Why are you telling us we don't need technology?" And we say, "Because you don't need that technology. You know, European countries and companies have wasted millions on buying that technology where they didn't need it." But I think the more we look up the top of the waste hierarchy, the more we have to learn. So that repair culture. So you go to a market in Africa, nobody throws away anything that's fully functional. They give it to someone, or someone will fix it for them. Whereas here, it's, unless you're in London, there are some great organisations in London and some of the other big cities that will fix things. In Northampton, you'd be struggling to find someone to repair something for you. And if you could, the costs can be prohibitive compared to just replacing it.
Yes.
And so I think we need to look much more carefully and globally at what is best practice, rather than just looking at it from a European or a North American perspective, and see what can we learn. And this whole idea of prevention and reuse. When I was a child, all those years ago, I used to subsidise my my pocket money by going to collect bottles with deposits on and using that to buy more fizzy drinks and more crisps. Now, I'm not suggesting we necessarily need a return to deposit schemes, and in some cases I think it would be an error. But what we do need to do is find a way that incentivises people to do the right thing. And that might be charging, it might be more effective utilisation of policy, because I think often policy drivers are fairly weak. And when we're talking about things like producer responsibility, I think they're almost looking at that from we're abdicating any responsibility to the manufacturers. And as I mentioned earlier, we regularly hear about supermarkets, "Oh, it's their fault I've got all of this stuff." But actually, it's not, because you chose to go and get it. Yes. You chose to buy that thing. And so I think we need a review. We talk about it in electronics, about the best of both worlds. When does it stop becoming better to manually do something and bring in technology? And I think we need to look at that for collection schemes as well. Actually having more local centralised systems, and maybe less doorstep systems. Yes. You know, pretty much everyone in my village is within, not giving away anything about my lifestyles, within 10 minutes walk of the pub. And most people, only because that's where the main pet walking area is as well. It's nothing to do with going to the pub. But most people go near there, or near the school, or the church. You know, you've got the three cornerstones of the community that most people relate to one or the other. So somewhere near that, in that triangle, you could put collection schemes. So
and it's also then visible what you're doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's a good idea. I mean, the schools, I think, are missed out. So, you know, as a communal gathering place, then most people talk about bring sites located in supermarket, car parks and such like. But places like schools, churches, then why not? And if there was a market for properly separated materials as well, then they could also stand to raise funds. And we did this when I was at school back in 1850. That we used to collect newspapers to raise that money for the school. So
yeah,
that
we
side,
used to too.
yeah. So why not reinvoke that and make it a more community-based activity, and make sure that the rewards are then hypothecated to the people who are doing the work, because then you can close the loop. The people who behave in a certain way benefit from that, preferably at community level. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah. And I think particularly in developing countries, we tend to ignore it here, but to make sure that when you're devising these new systems, because actually, if you look at it, the way they've got the markets set up, the way they have the collection schemes, so in a lot of countries you have someone from the informal sector who will go around to your house and collect things regularly and sort it for you. Now, if it was already sorted, their job would be much easier.
Yes, entirely.
So do you have any summary comments or conclusions, any key messages you'd like to make?
I think overall we're far from optimal in the way that we provide and plan collection systems, and I think we need a more inclusive approach, so something that involves speaking to and recognising the needs of the people who will use the materials that are collected, as well as the people who will be segregating them for them. I think more community-based communal facilities would be a big advantage in the UK and globally, partly because of the efficiency, the lack of need for highly frequent collections, and also because of the visibility. So the kind of social side of this, people seeing people doing positive actions for the benefit of others and for themselves.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. The only thing I'd probably add is that I think we do need, in many cases, a fundamental review, as we mentioned earlier, of the collection schemes we use, because we've changed from collecting. They're called dustbins because they used to collect the residues from fires, and apart from the fact they've changed mainly from metal to plastic or to bags, beyond that, they haven't really changed that much. And I think rather than tweaking the systems, we have to start from a point of, if you were to try and collect these valuable materials, how would you do it? And countries that don't have the systems already in place have an opportunity to start with that proviso rather than try and fix the problem afterwards. Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Margaret, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.